nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Well, hello, Sublation Media viewers, all you sublators out there. It's I, Douglas Lain. I'm the co-host of the Sublation Magazine show here with Benjamin Studebaker, author of the book Billy Moon, which is about the May 68 student worker strikes in Paris, and also about Winnie the Pooh. And I'm the head honcho at Sublation Media. Benjamin, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
All right. So when was it? Was it yesterday? It was over the weekend that there was a big No Kings protests.
Yep. Always the weekend with these guys.
Right. And I heard about it many times before it happened. Of course, the No Kings motto or slogan has been around for a while. I think it started up when Trump first launched his attack on the executive branch.
There was another round of these protests back in June. If you look on Wikipedia now, there are two separate Wikipedia articles, one for the June and one for the October.
Right, but there were, before the June, there were moments where they were testing out the No Kings slogan. And
yes, in some competition with the no oligarchy thing.
Right.
Do we frame this as an oligarchy problem or a king's problem? These are two totally different types of regimes in antiquity.
Right. Well, I think it was a matter of, are we aiming at Elon Musk or at Donald Trump? And now that
Musk is out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kings. The people who were most excited to tell me about the No Kings protests were geriatric white ladies. My aunt, who is living in Tennessee, and one of my mother's friends in this neighborhood, both were telling me about how excited they were about the protests and how delighted they were about how big it was going to be. And if I was in Portland right now, which I'm not, I'm in Colorado, but if I was at home in Portland, I would dig up my pussy hat for this episode. But am I wrong in thinking that this was largely aimed at female, older demographic, these No Kings protests?
Boomers. What do retirees and college students in the 60s have in common? They don't go to work.
Right. So, but also they did have it on a weekend. The workers could have turned up,
yes,
theoretically.
Yes. The interesting thing is, even though they held it on a weekend, so that workers could go without striking or causing any kind of large-scale disruption, nonetheless, you overwhelmingly see retirees in the imagery, in the photos. It's a very old crowd.
Right. And that is interesting, which is not at all true of the pro-Palestinian movement, for example.
Quite the opposite in that case. That is overwhelmingly students.
Yeah, it's overwhelmingly young. So the way I'm thinking about this, and we're going to discuss Ubu Roi later on, but the way I'm thinking about this is that this really, of course, on the surface, I am 100% behind the slogan, no more kings. You know, it's an old one, but I appreciate it. I don't want to be ruled over by a king or a queen, for that matter. And it's a very American sounding slogan and protest. It doesn't hit the wrong note precisely, but if you look below the surface, my thought is that this is a battle between the entrenched bureaucracy and the newly elected executive. That at least that's how it originally emerged. There's lots of things that Trump has done that you can see as tyrannical or at least authoritarian. in terms of designating or rhetorically designating domestic political groups as terrorists, as an example, or the use of ICE agents to round people up without badges, and in ways sometimes that it's just prone to be creating moments of abuse.
There's
And
lots of policies one can dislike.
yeah,
The question is, what are we talking about here?
right.
Is this an elected official who is in conflict with the permanent civil service?
Mhm.
Or is this someone who is trying to make themselves a king and who's in opposition to elections?
Right. Oh, well.
Is his legitimacy coming from elections, or is he there principally to attack the system of elections? In calling him a king, they are suggesting that he doesn't operate through elections, that he couldn't in practice do the things he's doing through elections. He would need to be or to be trying to become something other than an elected official to do the things that he's doing.
Okay, let's try to steel man that argument. What are the best arguments for the idea that Trump ultimately doesn't want to seek his legitimation or authority from suffrage and elections, but rather is aiming to create a dictatorship, a monarchy, some sort of authoritarian rule that ignores the will of the demos or the people?
I think for the people who have that view, they look at the events of following January 6th, leading up to, including, and following January 6th. And they claim that January 6th constitutes a knowing and deliberate attempt to destroy the elections and to continue to run the country in defiance of the electoral result by propagating lies. That would be their core argument. It would be around that event.
I mean, just
so the narrative that one has of that event is very central.
Right, but just to be simple-minded about it, Trump did not remain in office. Another president took the White House. He was president for 4 years. There was an election. Trump won that election. So,
right. So my argument is it doesn't matter what Trump might want to do or what he intends or what he says. There's a material question about, is it actually possible for the president of the United States, whoever it might be, to remain in office in defiance of the election result? Is that something that can actually be done? If it can't be done, it doesn't matter what particular people who happen to occupy that office think or say or wish. It doesn't empower them in a de facto sense to do that thing. So in the case of January 6th, we have quotes from members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who say that they were prepared to haul Trump out of office if he had attempted to continue to remain in despite that election result. We have clear evidence of that. Now, the next move in the argument, if you're talking to your Boomer No King's uncle, will be, but since then, hasn't he purged the military of people who would stand up to him in the case that he did this again? If we had a rerun of 2020 now with the people who are military officials, would they not go along with it now, whereas they wouldn't have done in 2020 because of purging that is alleged to have taken place? And in these cases, this relies on making claims about what is in the minds of military officers, which is something that's extremely difficult to do. Even if you are the president of the United States, guessing about what's in the minds of military officers and what they will or won't tolerate is extraordinarily difficult. It only becomes easy when military officers have said things that allow you to anticipate what they would do. And any military officer who says something that allows you to anticipate what they might do has weighed in on civilian matters while holding a military office, which means their competence to hold a military office is called into question by the fact that they've said something that allows you to identify them politically. Anyone who is actually good at being a military officer will not say anything that will allow you to identify where they sit politically. And therefore, you will not know what it is that they would do in that circumstance until that circumstance arises. In the case of the members of the Joint Chiefs, we have some of their stated beliefs on the record because they wrote books or were quoted in books after 2020 on the assumption that Donald Trump was gone and was never going to come back, and they could now cash in on the role that they had played in making sure that that did not happen, or in being prepared to make sure that that did not happen.
Right. So, I mean, just to be clear, the last election was one where both parties said that if the opposite presidential candidate won, there would be no more elections, there would be no more democracy. And they both pointed to some kind of evidence to justify those beliefs. In the case of the Republicans, if you look deep, there was there were real efforts to suppress Trump and his chances, and even there were some wargaming exercises or some exercises around how to create the situation where the military might step in the case of a close election where Trump was seen to have won, to remove him from office. That was one. I think it was Podesta who was overseeing that exercise.
Well, that also clearly did not occur.
Right. No, I mean, right. Obviously, in 2024, well, it wasn't a particularly close electoral win. And so there was no, there was no.
It was close
opening
at the level of the popular vote, but there wasn't going to be an opening for that in any case. People can have all sorts of thoughts about what they're going to do. The military, if the military attempted to overthrow a presidential election result, that wouldn't go very well for them. They would struggle to get large parts of society to go along with that.
I think the way that Podesta was thinking in the wargaming exercises that he ran in 2020 was if there was a repeat of 2000, where it came down to a very narrow electoral college win,
It would go to
decided by a couple hundred votes, which is what happened in 2000. It would be possible, and there was a legal battle that was ambiguous. It would be possible for the decision to move from the level of the Supreme Court, which was the institution that decided the 2000 election.
It wouldn't be.
Okay.
It wouldn't be. That was wishful thinking on the part of the people who entertain that kind of thought. The military can intervene to defend the election result. It can't intervene to overturn the election result. And the military knows that.
Yeah, but what counts as defending the election result can be thrown into question. Like in 2000,
to a point.
In 2000, the ultimate result of surveying all the votes showed that Al Gore actually won the popular vote, not only nationally, which he did, but also in Florida, which meant that he did win the electoral college
But
vote.
the court ruled that that was not the case.
Right. The court ruled that that was not the case.
So therefore, it's not the case.
Actually, the court actually didn't rule at all about what was the case.
Well, it prevented that from becoming the official result through its ruling.
Right.
The military can act to uphold a ruling of the court. The military is not going to intervene against the court. If the court sides with one of the parties in a question about the election, the military will side with whoever has the court.
Right. Right. No,
because the court will decide what the fact is from the point of view of the military.
Why
the
is that?
military can intervene on behalf of the fact that the court has.
What about the Congress? I mean, what if the Congress moved to politically overturn the decision?
In an election, the Congress is also up for a vote. So in an election, the question of who is sitting in the Congress and what's the legitimate Congress is also a question, which is why when there's a real dispute about the election, it has to go to the court makes a ruling, and then the military will defend the ruling of the court in extremis. Okay. Because it's called into question at the level of the parties. So you can't have one Congress making an intervention to try to prevent a new Congress from sitting. This will not fly. The court will say that you can't do this, and the military will back the court up.
Okay. All right. I'm just trying to push the argument as far as I can, on the other side.
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
I mean, yeah,
And the thing is, people are like, how can I be so sure about this? You have to think about how legitimacy actually works in this country.
Mhm.
It's the election from which the electoral officials derive their legitimacy. If the electoral officials act against the elections, this really calls their legitimacy into question.
Mhm.
The court, however, is full of justices who everyone has agreed for some years now are Supreme Court justices. So in an election, the court becomes very strong because the legitimacy of all of the people in the election who have elected offices that were up for election in that year is questionable. But the legitimacy of the justices is secure. They're not up for election. They're not subject to any electoral questioning about whether they are, in fact, Supreme Court justices. So when you have an election that's questionable, the court enjoys a huge legitimacy advantage during that event,
Well,
which is part of its function and role.
Okay, but
And it has performed this function and role multiple times historically, including in the famous Rutherford Hayes,
I want to throw in the Fourth Estate and the character of that 2000 Supreme Court decision.
Yeah.
And throw in a hypothetical, okay, that something that didn't happen. But in 2000, the Supreme Court ruled that it would violate the civil rights of voters in Florida for the votes to be recounted. Why? Because there are different standards of counting in different counties. Of course, those different standards of counting had applied to the first round of voting and the first count, right? So and that's just one argument against this, but the civil rights justification for blocking the recount seemed to be specious at the time, and especially considering that they made statements that their decision should not be taken as setting a precedent, that this was a one-time only decision.
Yeah, we're in the realm of doxa. In a contested election,
Well,
there's opinions
hold on.
on
Let
both
me introduce
both sides.
Let me introduce
You're
my
not going to
hypothetical.
adjudicate it at the level of any kind of discussion because the election is established that you're not going to do that.
Okay,
so
but
therefore, it goes to the court.
Let me throw in a hypothetical. What if it had been revealed that the Bush administration had used threats of violence to wring out that decision from the Supreme Court, that they'd kidnapped relatives or held people at gunpoint?
How is the Bush campaign going to do that? The Bush campaign doesn't control the power of the sword.
Let's say that a faction, I'm just hypothetically, a faction within the CIA, which was loyal to its former CIA director, George Bush Sr., launched a military action.
And they keep this from all the other parts of the state, and none of the other parts of the state know that this force occurs.
They managed.
How do we find out about it?
No, it manages to become knowledge, but through the Fourth Estate, this leaks out. We know about it. So at that point, what would the Supreme Court's legitimacy be contestable?
Well, at that point, the thing to do would be to go after whichever rogue part of the state attempted to coerce the court, because that would clearly be illegal on behalf of that part of the state. Also, why would the court not immediately say that there's been an attempt by armed people to coerce the court?
Because
the obvious response for the court is to say
they want to live.
An attempt has been made to coerce the court.
Listen, help me write my novel here. They want to live, and no, I understand. Well, let's say they do, but let's say they say it.
Well, this is why you don't try this if you're the CIA. If you try this, the obvious thing for the court to do is say the CIA has attempted to control the Supreme Court with force, and if the Supreme Court were to say that and to issue some sort of a formal statement accusing the CIA of having done this, and if one of the members of the Supreme Court were to disappear mysteriously, this would also raise a lot of eyebrows. So, it's a very difficult thing to really pull off, which is why people don't even really think to try this stuff. It's very risky. And what's the reward ultimately? Because the CIA can't govern the country. The CIA doesn't have legitimacy to run the country directly.
Right. And the thing is, it's much easier just to cheat in the normal way, right? I mean, just stuff a few ballot boxes, gerrymander.
Well, gerrymandering is very different from stuffing ballot boxes.
True.
Right? Gerrymandering operates through the formal procedures. Messing with the elections a little bit here and there through the formal procedures, that's very normal, because the formal procedures are how we decide what counts as a legitimate election. So anything that you can potentially litigate through the formal procedures, if you can get the procedures to issue a change in the procedures, you're operating through the procedures.
Right.
So you're not doing something which is ballot box stuffing, which is illegal and dangerous and potentially can get you arrested.
But this does happen, and people do get arrested for it. I mean,
very rarely. It's really not a very common practice in rich, established democracies for people.
But it has happened in the last decade.
Even in developing states, ballot box stuffing is increasingly something people don't do, because it's obvious, it's very easy to spot it, people get caught doing it. It's something that incompetent people do, or people used to do in the 20th century in very poor states. It very rarely occurs now. Even in states that we might think of as having rigged or bad elections, ballot box stuffing is not the typical technique or strategy for doing this at this stage.
When I say ballot box stuffing, I'm also thinking about messing with the electronic voting machines, flipping ballots.
Yeah, this kind of stuff is not the typical way in which it operates. The authoritarian states that have elections just to justify the authoritarianism, they'll operate by preventing people from having ballot access.
Right.
That's typically how they'll do it. They will kind of shape who's on the ballot to limit the choice, to restrict the choice. That's more typically how it occurs.
And that happens
in the United States, you could make the case that our primary system has a function of doing that. But even if you make that argument, it's still the case that the primary system enjoys broad support from the public as being a democratic institution. Whereas in many of these authoritarian states, the committees that prevent people from having ballot access on the basis of their religious or political views are not generally regarded as democratic institutions.
I want to point something out that I think should be obvious. And of course, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, right? But in order to make the case that Trump wants to be king, I had to go down the rabbit hole of kind of a quasi-conspiracy theorist notion of the last election, like recasts the last election where it was fairly clear that the result was sketchy. And that was in 2000, I think. Really, that result was very questionable. Whether it was very consequential is a completely different matter. But 4 years ago or 5 years ago, if I were saying the exact same things, I would be considered a Trumpist, because these are the kinds of things that Trump supporters were saying after the 2020 election. They were, and now the No Kings protests is essentially making a similar argument in advance of the next election, that there will be cheating, that the election is vulnerable.
Another thing I've seen that's interesting in connection to this is that there's an attempt to pressure the Supreme Court to make rulings that are not favorable to the president. So one of the arguments that's being made is that if the Supreme Court doesn't agree that the president is exceeding his authority, then the Supreme Court is rolling over for him, or is in his pocket, is not sufficiently independent from him. And this kind of thing, I noticed, coming up in relation to Amy Coney Barrett was recently on the Ross Douthat, his new podcast that he's got, Interesting Times. And there are all these questions that people want to ask. And because the decisions and the cases are ongoing, she won't answer a lot of the questions. But all of these questions about whether the court has to do something to show people that it's able to constrain the president. And it's interesting because the way the court works is by being impervious to these kinds of demands from people.
Right.
Up until the point at which it produces a real capacity on the part of the legislature to change the court's composition and structure, the court can ignore short-term immediate legitimacy concerns.
Right.
But there's been a lot of effort to frame the court as having to oppose Trump to prove that it's not weak.
Right. But that hasn't had an effect, at least none that anyone would cop to.
He was asking, Duthett was asking Coney Barrett what the court would do if the president ignored a court decision. And the answer is that it's not for the court to do anything in that situation. It's for Congress to impeach the president on the grounds that the president has broken the law.
Right.
In that situation. That's the mechanism. And in a situation where the court impeaches the president and the president refuses to go, you then have a 2-on-1 situation. And in a 2-on-1 situation, the expectation is that the military sides with the 2 against the 1, which is why presidents who face impeachment leave, because they can't get the military to keep them in office in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
It works in a relatively predictable way, because to have the level of public support that's necessary for these different things to happen, it heavily constrains the type of situation you can be in. To be in a situation where the court makes a ruling and Congress impeaches the president, public opinion has to be such that it's very difficult for the president to carry on, no matter what the particulars are.
Right. I mean, to be more realistic here than we've been being, what this No Kings protest is really about is not suffrage or the vote or whether or not he'll leave office or anything like that. It's about how much authority the executive should have over the executive branch. It's about the theory of the unitary executive. It's about how much power lifelong bureaucrats or just unelected officials should have to set up quasi-laws through the executive branch, and to what degree they should be loyal to and following the directives of the executive, and following his policy proposals, his administrative aims.
And the upsetness is with Congress and with the court for not taking positions on these issues that align with the interests of the civil servants. Right.
And it is worth noting that not that long ago, a long time ago now, but, within my lifetime, the Democrats and the left had the exact opposite view, almost the exact opposite view as they have now. They were concerned about regulatory capture by corporate power. They felt that the bureaucrats that were not only creating regulation, but adjudicating its implementation, like interpreting it, were far too biased towards big money and corporate power, and that the courts and the elected officials would be a check against that corporate bureaucratic power within the state.
Now, you can make an argument for the other side. You can make an argument for the civil servants and the bureaucrats on the grounds that the legislature is too slow now in many different areas, or that the legislature lacks the technical expertise, or that the court lacks the technical expertise, or is too slow.
Yeah, I mean, and those were the arguments made at the time that defeated leftists and created the regulation in the 80s that has been recently overturned.
Right, but there's a reason that those arguments have a plausible sounding character. There is a case for the bureaucrats. The issue is that we're not having that discussion. The King's language gets us away from the real discussion that is there to be had. And I'm not here to say definitively whether electeds or bureaucrats, in a power struggle between the two, who should prevail. I don't necessarily have one fixed answer to that question that would apply across the board. I think there is a reason that bureaucracy exists. I think you couldn't easily get rid of it or do without it entirely. I think if somebody were to propose that extreme argument, the extreme argument of there should be no bureaucrats, Nobody should have created any bureaucracy. Nobody should regulate the amount of lead that's in the protein powder. No, I don't think that's an argument that would carry much weight with much of the public.
Well,
however,
those are
we're not discussing that.
There are two different claims there. There should be no federal bureaucracy is not the same claim as no one should regulate the amount of lead that's in the drinking water. There would be other mechanisms that
leave it up to them to self-regulate.
Well, also
they
could
didn't
leave
do
it up
a very
to,
good job of that.
It
That's
would be
part
a
of
matter
why
of-
we got all of this.
It'd be a matter of more local or state level, community based.
But then you have the competitive incentive to deregulate because you don't want to make it more expensive or more arduous to produce something in one state versus another state.
No, I'm sure there's arguments against it.
Across the state lines, so you can't punish your neighboring state for allowing a bunch of lead in their product with a tariff. There are reasons why we had to create something like the FDA.
I agree, there are reasons why, but I'm just saying that that the extreme statement that would be no regulation of how much lead is in drinking water is wrong. There wouldn't
be very effective regulation, and indeed
people say there aren't very effective regulations now.
Yeah, but people now exaggerate that. They exaggerate that. Mm-hmm. It has deteriorated. If you look at, for instance, the number of FDA inspections that occur. It used to be in the 70s that you had to inspect everything within a 2-year period. And if anything, some stuff was inspected more than once every 2 years, to the point where the argument in the 80s was, are there unnecessary inspections that are occurring in cases where they're really not needed? And could funds be saved by trimming some inspections? Mm-hmm. And then from there, that argument snowballed. And now we're in a situation where a lot of food outlets get inspected once every 3 to 5 years. And if somebody files a report, there's not much capacity to take it up as an emergency and do an emergency inspection. So there has been degradation in the capacity to do inspections. And that leads to, I think, some appropriate complaints about inefficiency. But it should be remembered that in the 70s, there was a more effective inspection regime that was widely feared by food companies to a much greater degree than now. Now, there were complaints even then about, is the regulator too much in bed with the companies being regulated? And these complaints had substantial validity. There's all sorts of stuff that perhaps they should have tested for or regulated in the 70s that they didn't, or that they were reluctant to add to the set of things that they had to check. But they did check a lot. And this checking a lot meant that things like that recent story about there being lead in protein powder, that's something that in the 70s would have been, these are the kinds of things that people really did keep an eye on. There has been change in this area.
When I was a young man, way back in the 1991, I worked for OSPRG, the Oregon State Public Interest Research Group. And one of the things that we were working on was passing or lobbying for state level legislation to tighten the controls around lead in water and food and so forth. And that was Ralph Nader's organization, the PIRGs. And in the 90s, he ran as essentially a consumer rights advocate for president. I failed in the 90s to make much of a difference in that direction, and the PIRGs failed. And I can say that with an anecdote, which is that when my two older kids, were in high school, they, in the middle of their junior and senior year, stopped letting the kids use the drinking fountains. Why? Because there was lead in the drinking water.
In the pipes. The lead pipes thing is a different problem from lead in your food.
I know it is, but nonetheless, it's a regulatory problem. I mean, it's
an infrastructure problem too, because you have to replace the pipes, and this is costly. Whereas it's not that difficult to remove lead from food. There really isn't a good excuse for there being lead in protein powder. Whereas lead in drinking water in the school is a consequence of a huge amount of lead pipe having been laid a long time ago. That's a much more difficult and intractable thing to sort out. It requires more money. It requires more commitment on the part of the state to solve that problem. That's not to say that it couldn't be done or isn't easy to do, just lay new pipe. But it does at least have an infrastructure component.
But they surely had known about the lead pipe problem for a long, long time before they finally decided to.
Yes, but the attitude about pipes, the piping situation was different. Just because we're talking about lead doesn't mean that all cases involving lead are precisely treated the same.
Oh, I understand, but it did come to mind. I do see the difference. Yeah,
sure. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that there's anything sufficient about this kind of regulation, that it fixes capitalism or makes it okay in any way. Nevertheless, there are certain things that the state does as a consequence of excesses that will tend to otherwise occur, that if you don't have these things happening, it enshittifies life substantially. It makes things even more brutal and even more miserable. And I'm not for immiseration. I don't think that we should be trying to create conditions under which people are very, very unhappy, dealing with very serious problems that they then have to expend all of their energies just trying to get out from under.
Right. I mean, I think it's worth
returning
to the No Kings protest, though, to kind of recalibrate the conversation a bit, because in reality, the Trump administration is not arguing against there being federal bureaucracy in the executive branch that would be handling the regulation of things like lead in protein powder or even in schools, ultimately.
No, but some of the arguments to do with RFK brush up against this, because some of the arguments to do with RFK suggest that here you have, their argument would be, here you have an official who's been appointed to head a department who doesn't believe in the science, which undergirds a lot of the regulatory state.
Sorry, I got distracted by this comment. Doug and Ben discuss laying pipe, also a category on X video. Anyway, go ahead.
Now, to like have this be all of the arguments considered, RFK Jr., some of the things that he's done or tried to do are to do with imposing new food regulations that make certain things that we know are dangerous less common in food, like food dye. That's a case where we have plenty of scientific evidence suggesting that food dye is not good for you, and RFK Jr. has attempted to remove the food dye. And in this case, he is operating with the science and potentially trying to tighten up regulations in a way that might lead to safer food. There are other cases in which he's viewed as being not in alignment with the science. And in those cases, he's accused of potentially undermining the functioning of regulation. And the issue is, if you have an elected official or someone appointed by an elected official and then confirmed by the Congress, which consists of other elected officials, that person might have a kind of sometimes in alignment, sometimes not in alignment position vis-a-vis the technocrats. The technocrats want to say that they have scientific knowledge that has authority, and that the people that are appointed to run their departments should have to listen to this stuff that they've gone to great pains going through school and doing all the things they're supposed to do to acquire. But if there is a political question about that epistemology, how is that to be adjudicated? You would need, it would seem, some sort of elected official capacity to make a judgment if public policy ultimately rests on a democratic mandate. So there's a question about epistemology and about the relationship between democracy and technocracy. And I think when you're in a situation where you're losing elections, you've got elected officials coming in who don't agree with the epistemology underlying some of the scientific policies that we have. In that kind of situation, trying to get the court to protect you from the electeds is not a great long-term strategy.
Right.
A great long-term strategy would be to win back the confidence of the public so that officials get elected who see the value in the technocratic expertise that you possess.
To back you up here on this, my understanding now, maybe there are better examples than what I'm about to raise, but my understanding is that RFK and by extension Trump has taken a position on Tylenol, which seems to be from planet Neptune.
Right.
Okay.
And yet the public votes these people in. So
Mhm.
we've reached a stage where at this point, the American public is so confused about what is real science, not real science,
Mhm.
and so unsure about the claims that technocrats and educated people are making, that this Tylenol claim is just kind of in there with a basket of other crazy things the administration thinks, says, and does. It's not a reason in terms of polling to change your view about the administration. And this is a symptom of a legitimacy crisis afflicting science itself.
Right. But you would think that, because I watched the hearings on RFK, and the hearings where he was appointed ultimately, and I watched people like Bernie Sanders and others really come across as dogmatic enforcers of received opinion rather than people who would be willing to actually, on any level, debate the science and hear RFK's positions and refute them. Right? But it would seem to me that the Tylenol question would be an example where you could draw him on the carpet, make a good solid case. I mean, I'm assuming that Tylenol
It would seem that way. But if you're just having a science argument at the level of speech and debate rhetoric,
Mm-hmm.
that can go all sorts of different ways. If you put people in a speech and debate setting and have them argue about a scientific question, any kind of outcome is possible there. A speech and debate setting, you could convince people to end up endorsing anything on the basis of charisma and other kinds of bizarre, linguistic techniques and strategies.
But that's what you need to have.
It's something that you can't just talk out on the floor of the assembly. The case for the technocrats is that if you try to have a democratic deliberation about scientific questions,
Mm-hmm.
that this will not produce the outcomes that are regularly in alignment with reality.
Well, this is the role of this is the role of the fourth estate. This is a role of the schools. This is what an educated and informed public who reads or at least listens and has time to reflect upon what they're hearing.
But in practice, it never worked like that. In practice, it was a public which knows who knows, not a public that's able to itself evaluate these questions through a democratic deliberation, but a public that's able to recognize who knows something versus who doesn't know something on the basis of various social markers that were viewed as reliably tracking that.
I know you're right, Ben, but this is just so counter to my basic ethos. This is so stands in such opposition to what
the technocrats are kind of like a new aristocracy in this sense. They carry themselves in a way which seems to suggest to you that they know what they're talking about, and they get results often enough that seem to suggest that they do genuinely know something. And on the basis of this, you defer to them and think of them as better than you. It works very much like the aristocracy works. The aristocrat acts like he's better than you. Because he acts like he's better than you, you believe it. He seems to genuinely be better than you. And as long as he gets results often enough, then it seems to be confirmed that he is in fact better than you. The university system works broadly the same way. But when academics stop acting like they're better than you and start saying all kinds of crazy things on Twitter and showing that they're emotional and all over the place and just as much moved by stupid propaganda as you are, then you're not going to believe that they know things you don't.
Right. Well, that's true. That's one factor. Someone says Doug gets the highs when you say experts, and that's true. Let's see if I can take that.
The epistemology is, I think, one of the under-discussed elements of this legitimacy crisis that we're having. We're at a stage where there's deep disagreement about what counts as knowledge and who counts as somebody who's likely to have it.
Right. And ultimately, I don't believe that the way you should begin to make a decision about an issue of knowledge is by deciding who gets to have the authority to hold the knowledge. That you instead need some basic standards of
but
reason.
You inevitably have to do some of this because there's too many different specialized areas of human knowledge at this stage for any one person to hold all of these things in their head. If you try to have an informed opinion that's your own view about everything, you will get to a point where this can't actually be sustained. You're not going to be able to spend enough time learning about enough things to have informed views about everything. And this is why academics who get PhDs in particular things tend to start throwing up their hands and going, well, I don't know anything about that, when they stray too far from their area of expertise and go, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure we can make claims about that. Because there is an awareness that the people who really would know something about that would have to have undertaken a form of life that we have not undertaken. And yet, once you make that concession, now you're in a position where a lot of the time, in a lot of areas that stray too far from your own expertise, you're having to use heuristics and make judgments based on whether somebody seems like they know what they're talking about.
Well, this is why, you and I had a debate or a conversation really about Ben Burgis's book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. And it was you thought it was a impoverished book because there were so many ways that just recognizing fallacies wasn't sufficient in terms of determining the truth. And obviously that's true, right? But he did spend a lot of time on fallacies. But my position is, if you can catch out someone in a fallacy, and be right about that they really are. It's not just you're claiming that what they're saying is fallacious, but it really is. If you can catch them out on that in a public debate, if they resort to authoritarian styles of debate,
but we don't agree on what counts as a fallacy. We don't. People don't agree about these things. And you can write in a book and go, I'm a professor of philosophy, let me tell you what a fallacy is. People are not going to agree with that just because, and to suggest that he can play that role is to make the move of going, well, he's a philosophy professor. He seems like the kind of person who would know what counts as a valid argument and what doesn't.
But I don't I think the only way you can know if Burgis's book is adequate to the task of defining and outlining and educating people about fallacious arguments is to read the book and to determine.
No, it would take much more than just reading the book. You would have to be completely baked in the philosophy discipline to be able to really properly evaluate all of the different claims that are made.
Well, I guess I am
spent huge amounts of your time
given my college
to properly
experience,
evaluate all of those claims.
Given
Otherwise,
my college
you're going to have to at some point draw
given
a
my
line
college
into
experience, Ben, I'm gonna say this. Given my college experience, I think I was thoroughly baked when I took philosophy. So, I guess that was why I thought I could determine what Burgess is.
I mean, you can have an opinion, and democracy works on the basis of these opinions that people have. But to try to bring order to these opinions and make rules for how people can form opinions and force people to follow these rules, this is a very different thing. To try to discipline everybody into operating under certain rules of logic or argumentative rules, and to then have public opinion be the process of everybody following rules that they've agreed to submit to, this kind of Kantian thing where everybody's supposed to be able to figure out what the rules require them to do and freely of their own accord choose to submit to these rules. This is not something which in practice is how it works.
Big Mustache says that I don't understand Aristotelian intellectual virtue, and then shakes their head at me. I think that's what that's SMH means. What do you think that Big Mustache is driving at there?
Well, maybe he thinks what I'm saying is Aristotelian, but of course in Aristotle's own time, you didn't have all of these different differentiated disciplines. In Aristotle's time, part of the thinking was that the philosopher would be able to potentially adjudicate across a broad range of domains because the philosopher could have access to a body of knowledge that would have wider applicability. Now, in Plato and Aristotle, there's still a lot of questions about exactly how far that goes. But if you were to read, say, the Stoics, who often took up elements of Plato or Aristotle and then made dogmatic claims on the basis of these elements that they had taken up, they would claim that every person on an individual level is capable of adjudicating every impression that comes across their brain. and that any time that they misadjudicate and say yes to something they should say no to, or no to something that they say yes to, they've done something wrong that they could not have avoided doing if their will was sufficiently strong. The kind of strong Stoic argument would claim that every person, qua being human, is able to do all of this and do it in every area, every domain, without failing, unerring, the Stoic sage, complete and total mastery of when to say yes and when to say no. In practice, the world is bigger and more complicated than that. It is not possible for a person, any person with a finite human body, to possess the capacities of a Stoic sage. And in thinking that people can do this, the Stoics drift into a kind of pride and hubris.
Mm-hmm.
The technocrats will say, well, we only recognize our own expertise within the very narrow domains in which we actually have done things such that we can have expertise. But even these claims are often too strong. Even these claims often overstate the scope of their own expertise substantially. And then, the deference to people in other areas, again, implies that other people can have a totalizing kind of expertise that goes beyond what really is possible for anybody. If you go all the way down into any kind of field and do a PhD in it, what you realize is that everybody disagrees about that field. Everybody disagrees about methods. Everybody disagrees about how we're supposed to do anything. And there are camps in the fields that have different views about what's an appropriate methodology or epistemology. And if you raise all of this to the level of public attention, then nobody would go along with anything.
Well,
no one would seem to know anything about anything, and everybody's expertise would be continuously challenged, which is why most public activity is done by people with master's degrees who are very self-assured and confident in themselves, because people with master's degrees think that they know things and therefore are often the most dangerous. They tend to be very stoic, people with master's degrees.
Well, someone says, I've lost track of this comment, but I'll try to summarize it from my memory here. Basically, that I'm claiming that if the truth were revealed through debate, the people would the majority of people would agree with the truth when revealed. And what I think I'm saying is not so much about always getting things right, or maybe not even ever getting things right, per se, but rather the process of public reason itself needing to be respected and enlisted in support of legitimating these institutions. That the part of having a free society is trusting the public. And more than just trusting the public, but allowing the public to reflect upon as much information as could be brought forward in a reasonable way, and to make decisions and be responsible for those.
But this has to operate within a kind of Tocquevillian faith. So you have to have faith that throwing these decisions to public discourse will work out, without looking too closely at any of the specific debates or arguments, because in many specific cases, if you actually take the trouble of forming opinions about the issues in question, you'll find that the public comes to positions that don't accord with your well-considered view. So it requires a faith which also involves, to some degree, refraining from positioning yourself as a judge, because it involves taking a position that you cannot be an expert, and therefore you cannot say better than the public what is true.
Well, I think that what you have to do is on the basis of your understanding, not necessarily on the basis of your expertise, which is a form of authority, in my opinion. You do politics.
But how can you in your own mind think that you know better than something which comes out of a discussion? To believe in public debate and public discourse is to believe that the discourse is more likely to find what's true or good or valuable than your own mind on its own.
Yeah, but I don't ever just rely on my own mind. I talk to you, I read books, I reflect upon various arguments from a
But
variety
you
of
draw
experts.
on a world that is biased in various ways, slanted by the kinds of people you befriend, the kinds of people you know, whereas the public debate draws on all of society, including people you would never talk to and have nothing to do with. You have to trust in that. And that's the difficult thing, because anybody from any particular position, when they look at the outcome of public debate, will see that as transgressing against many of their, what they would take to be their well-considered views. But their well-considered views are going to come from the circles they walk in and the particular parts of society with which they regularly interact. They're not going to be in dialogue with all of the other parts of society. And as you get a more complicated, more modern society, there are more and more and more parts that you can't possibly interact with or possibly know.
I guess my working assumption here is that as diverse as society, the global modernity seems to be, that there are some foundational principles at work, which are not just ideological, but also the foundational in terms of production and material life, and that we can understand those basic ideas, and that will inform our overall understanding, and that's something we kind of universally hold in common.
But if that were the case, we would agree more than we do as a society. We would have more consensus than we typically now have. And it used to be the case that we had more consensus and more agreement. Arguably, at different periods in the past, you could say that on the basis of, say, Congress more frequently having a large majority in favor of one party, or the president winning elections by a larger percentage of the vote, that there was a stronger level of social consensus. But these days, every election is won by the president by 2 points, 3 points at most.
I think that the difficulty, from my Marxist perspective, and I understand I'm sort of retreating into jargon, maybe, or into an ideological answer in a way, but my thought is that the lack of agreement has basically two roots. That the primary root of the lack of agreement is that ideological realm of rules and principles that we that operate in our society and keep things going, are in contradiction with themselves. So you will find that if you try to be consistent in the way you approach life in society, that you will end up contradicting yourself, because that's
but
the first thing I'll say. And let me get to the second part
of that.
Let me get to the second reason I think that this happens a lot, is that I also think there's a lot more disagreement amongst those who have been lucky enough or unlucky enough to be trained and educated as managers of this contradictory system, in which case that they're more likely to be kind of intensely self-contradictory and at odds with each other and themselves. So those are the two reasons I think this is happening. Go ahead now.
Yeah, capitalism certainly kicks up a certain amount of this. And then to take capitalism into the managerial bureaucratized mode, where you're trying to manage the contradictions of capitalism at the level of the state through a permanent bureaucracy, that's going to add even more to it. One of the things that's happened over the last 50 years is that the university educated part of the population has dramatically increased as a percentage of the total. Mm-hmm. And that's going to contribute to the two things you just laid out. That's going to make the society more fractious and more internally divided. And that is going to be something that's going to differentiate this period from earlier periods of capitalism where that was not the case, where you had a much smaller percentage of the population in managerial or quasi-managerial roles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it would have been much more obvious to those managers that they were non-identical with the working class. Much more obvious to them, and that they couldn't build any kind of effective political or social movement purely around themselves and their own interests and their own cultural mores. That would have been very obvious to them in the 40s or 50s. It's not obvious now to university graduates that they are not the base for society, at least not alone.
And maybe that's because, to some degree, because of the way that the university education has expanded, more and more people who are the base of society, those essential workers, have gone through the university system.
Oh, but also, there's a lot of confusion now. Who counts as an essential worker? Who counts? And production used to be in tension with agriculture mainly. And now production and agriculture seem also to be in contention with the service economy and with consumption and with parts of the economy that exist purely to serve consumption, which some people denounce as fake or as not providing real value. So there's all of these additional sources of conflict that have been kicked up. And I think at the same time also, there is a perception in the last 25 years of failure on the part of the managers. And this perception of failure, you could take it further back. You could take it back to the crisis of the 70s. But I think insofar as there was a moment where there was confidence in managers in the 90s, this has been further undone by 9/11 and the war on terror and the 2008 and COVID. And so there is more disagreement now about what constitutes expertise. And as you have more and more people going to the universities, a university graduate is less likely to strike most people as much better educated than everybody else. The gap starts to appear smaller, in part because there's a lot of them, and in part because as you have lots and lots of them coming through, the standards get lowered a bit so that more of them can graduate. So all of these things contribute to an environment where the kinds of appeals that you could make to a consensus or to the possibility of one don't stick in the way that they would have stuck at various points historically, and come to look like a kind of, to have something of a stoic character to them, really.
Well, listen, we didn't get to talk about Ubu Roi. Maybe I can talk to Rudy Grieser about that in the Parrot Room. But I do think that what we did here in this podcast was expose how if you tear the surface level propaganda off of the No Kings protests, what you have is a morass of difficulties and contradictions within both parties. The populists are no more likely to overcome the difficulties of our modern moment.
Everybody thinks they speak for everybody, but nobody does.
Well, I speak for everyone when I say thank you, Benjamin, for enlightening me in this conversation. I look forward to talking to you next week, and we will see all of you who are patrons, and you should all be patrons, over in the Parrot Room later today. I'll be putting that up, and I enjoy getting back to Portland. There are people out there enjoy the prospect of getting back to Portland. There are people who I was meeting with, like Evan, on a bi-weekly basis to talk about expansive realism and how we can create not just a kind of journalism that sticks to facts and truth and logic, but also an aesthetics of the real. And I want to get back to that. Maybe that's a cheat code or something. Maybe it's a hand wave. We are realists, but that's what I'm hoping will work as we go ahead. And anyway, yeah, everyone go over to Patreon, join us there. Thank you, Ben.
We could have a whole discussion about the term realist because it has so many different uses, and so often the motivation is something like that.
Right. All right, we should do that next week. I'll see you then.